Fall of 1992, Taylor County, Iowa. Picture a flat October morning. The fields have already been harvested, the corn stubble cut low. The sky is gray and close, the kind of gray that makes everything look faded. And out on a back road, on a piece of ground that most folks in Bedford County wouldn't have paid attention to, Russ Wischover is doing something that, by local standards, borders on crazy. He's driving fence posts into ground he just bought. Not a cornfield, not a bean field, not even decent pasture. 120 acres of former CRP ground, Conservation Reserve Program land that had been sitting idle, locked up under thick brome grass for 10 straight years. A decade of government checks and zero management. The brome had grown in dense and matted, crowding out everything else. Below the surface, the soil was compacted from years of pressure and no biological activity. Water hit the top and ran off instead of soaking in. Earthworms were scarce. Soil organic matter had bottomed out. The real estate agent had warned him, straight up, no sugarcoating. Russ, this ground's been ignored for a decade, and it still looks like hell. You're paying for dirt and disappointment. The neighbors had opinions too. At the co-op, one guy said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Russ just paid good money for a fancy weed patch." People laughed. A few felt sorry for him. Even his wife Carol had asked him the night before closing, "Russ, are you sure about this? That's a lot of money for ground nobody else wants." And Russ had told her what he always said when he'd already made up his mind. "I think it'll work." So 2 weeks after closing, he's out there in the cold October wind with his 17-year-old son Danny, and they're driving white plastic step-in posts into the hard earth. Post after post, the polywire unrolling behind them. One Energizer set up by the truck, and 3 neighbors are parked on the road, watching, not helping. Just watching, the way people do when they expect to see a mistake happen in real time. One of them was Leroy Barnes. Leroy farmed 400 acres down the section and had an opinion on everything. He rolled down his truck window and called across the ditch, "Russ, what the hell are you doing? That ground's been resting 10 years and it still looks like garbage. You gonna string wire on a dead field?" Russ didn't look up. He set the next post, leaned on the driver, and kept going. Leroy laughed. The short, sharp laugh of a man who thinks he's already right. "You're throwing good money after bad, buddy." Danny glanced at his dad. Russ's face didn't change. He just kept working. Now here's the thing about that moment. Most men would have felt it right there. That cold wave of doubt. The neighbors watching, the wife at home worried, the banknote sitting on the kitchen table. The ground that honestly, objectively, did look rough. Most men would have slowed down, asked themselves one more time if they were wrong. Russ kept driving posts, because he wasn't buying land, he was buying a chance, and he knew the difference. To understand why Russ did what he did, you need to understand where he came from. Russ was 47 years old in 1992. He'd been farming since he was old enough to drive a tractor. Corn and soybeans mostly, the standard Taylor County operation. A few beef cows on the side, the way a lot of guys did it back then. Not a big operation, but a real one, something he'd built with his own hands over 20 years. Then came the 1980s farm crisis. If you didn't live through that period in the Midwest, it's hard to explain what it felt like. Land values that had climbed through the 1970s collapsed. Interest rates hit 20%. Farmers who had borrowed to expand, who did exactly what the banks and the USDA told them to do, found themselves underwater almost overnight. Across Iowa, farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations went to auction. Neighbors lost everything. Some lost more than that. Russ survived it, but not without scars. He'd tightened every belt he had, sold machinery he didn't want to sell, watched his neighbors leave. By the time the 1990s came around, he was still standing, but he was tired of the way row crops worked. The constant exposure to commodity prices, the high input costs, the feeling that you were always one bad year away from serious trouble. He started reading about rotational grazing. Not online. This is 1990, 1991. He was reading USDA extension bulletins, a newsletter out of Missouri, a few photocopied articles that a neighbor had passed along. He talked to an extension agent named Dale Hofstetter over in Ringgold County, who'd been studying managed grazing for years. Dale showed him data, real numbers. What happened to soil organic matter when you gave grass proper rest? What happened to carrying capacity? What happened to your hay bill? Russ was skeptical, but interested. He'd always been that way, slow to believe something until he could see evidence, but genuinely open to evidence when it showed up. And then, the CRP contracts started expiring. All across southern Iowa, ground that had been locked up for a decade under grass started coming back on the market. The government program had paid landowners to pull marginal cropland out of production and plant it to grass or other cover. The idea was to reduce erosion and cut commodity surpluses. It worked, to a degree. But when those 10-year contracts ended, most of that land came back cheap. Nobody wanted it. It was too rough for row crops without major tillage and inputs. And most cattle producers looked at the compacted brome and saw a problem, not an opportunity. Russ saw it differently. He figured this. 10 years of uninterrupted rest had at least stopped the clock on whatever damage had been done before. The brome might be shallow-rooted and crowded, but underneath it, the soil biology hadn't been tilled or hit with anhydrous in a decade. It was dormant, maybe, not dead. And if you could get the grass responding to the right management, if you could use the cattle the way the land needed them to be used, maybe you could wake that soil back up. It wasn't a theory he'd read in one place. It was a conclusion he'd pieced together from several years of reading and one long conversation with Dale Hofstetter over bad coffee at a diner in Mount Ayr. So he scraped together the money, bought the 120 acres, told Carol he was going to try rotational grazing. Carol asked if he was sure. He said he thought it would work. Danny looked both nervous and excited, the way a teenager does when his dad is doing something either brilliant or stupid, and there's no way to know yet which one. The neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Russ didn't argue with any of them. He ordered polywire and step-in posts. The first thing Russ did was walk the whole 120 acres, slowly, with a notebook. He was mapping the land the way a doctor maps a patient before deciding on treatment. Where did water sit after rain? Where were the low spots? Where did the brome look thickest? Where were there signs of any other plant species trying to come in? He spent 2 full days doing nothing but walking and writing. What he found confirmed what he'd expected, but made it concrete. The southern third of the property had a drainage issue. Water pooled there after any significant rain and sat for days. The northern section had the best soil, where years ago someone had grown crops on the better ground before putting it in CRP. The middle section was the worst, compacted, nearly pure brome, almost no diversity. He also found something he hadn't expected. In 2 corners of the property, sheltered from the prevailing wind by old fence rows, there were patches of native grass and forbs that had survived under the brome. Blue grama, a little big bluestem, some wild bergamot. Small patches, maybe half an acre total. But they were there. That mattered to Russ. It told him the biology wasn't completely dead. It was just suppressed. He laid out the paddock plan on paper before he drove a single post. 10 paddocks, 120 acres divided roughly by topography and drainage, not just evenly by size. Some paddocks were bigger, some smaller, depending on what the land looked like and how he expected the grass to perform. He mapped the water source, one existing pond on the property that he'd confirmed was reliable, and planned the paddock layout so every section could access water without cattle having to cross from one paddock to another. The system itself was simple and cheap. polywire, plastic step-in posts, one energizer, a decent one. He didn't cheap out on the energizer because he knew a fence that didn't hold wasn't a fence. Total cost for the entire setup? Under $900. He'd spent more than that on herbicide in a single season on his corn ground. He started with 22 cow-calf pairs, about what the extension table said he should be able to run at the land's current condition, which his extension contact Dale estimated at maybe 0.5 to 0.6 pairs per acre. Conservative. Russ was okay with conservative. He wasn't trying to maximize anything in year one. He was trying to learn. The first rotation started in early May when the brome was actively growing. He put the cattle in the first paddock and watched. He was out there every morning with his measuring stick, checking grass height. Going in, he wanted the grass at 8 to 10 inches. Coming out, he wanted it grazed down to 3 or 4 inches, but not lower, not scalped. Scalped meant the plant had to rebuild from almost nothing, burning root reserves. 3 to 4 inches meant there was still leaf area to capture sunlight and restart growth. Every paddock got a rest period. At the start, he was rotating every 3 to 4 days, moving cattle through all 10 paddocks over roughly 30 to 40 days, then starting over. He wrote everything down: in height, out height, days in, days resting, weather, temperature, rainfall. Page after page in a spiral notebook that lived in his shirt pocket. The first time the cattle came out of a paddock, it looked bad. Grazed down, uneven, some areas almost bare where the cattle had congregated near the water tank. Leroy Barnes drove by that afternoon, slowed almost to a stop, looked at the paddock through his truck window, and shook his head without saying anything. Which, from Leroy, was almost worse than a comment. Russ kept moving the cattle. By the time the first paddock came back around for the second grazing, about 35 days of rest, something had happened. The grass was higher than Russ had expected. Not lush, not impressive by any standard, but it was there, it was growing, and when he pushed his boot into the soil near a brome clump, it wasn't quite as concrete hard as it had been in May. He wrote it down. He didn't celebrate. He just wrote it down and kept going. The first year was grinding. The hay bills were still high because the pastures weren't yet producing enough to carry the herd through lean periods without supplementation. Carol watched the numbers carefully. She kept a separate ledger for the CRP ground, tracking every input and every dollar of hay against what Russ was projecting they'd save in future years. The math didn't look great in year one. It wasn't supposed to. Leroy Barnes stopped by a few times that summer, usually in the late afternoon when the light was long and golden. He'd pull up to the fence, lean on the hood of his truck, and watch the cattle working through a paddock. Then he'd look at Russ. "You still playing farmer with that string fence?" Russ would nod and keep working. But inside, Russ will tell you, it bothered him. Not because he thought Leroy was right, but because doubt doesn't need a reason to show up. It just shows up. Especially in the evening, when you're tired and the numbers aren't yet what you need them to be, and your wife is looking at the ledger with that particular expression that doesn't say anything out loud, but says plenty. Russ kept the notebook. He kept moving the cattle. He kept measuring. The real test arrived in the summer of 1995, year 3. Iowa got hit with one of those dry summers that show up every decade or so. Not a true drought by official definition, but dry enough and hot enough that by mid-July, most conventional pastures in Taylor County were done. Brown. Finished. The grass had gone dormant or just died back, and the problem with continuous grazing, which is what most of those operations were running, is that there's no recovery period built in. When the grass stops, it stops completely. Neighbors started making hard decisions in early July. A few sold cows early, cutting their herd rather than feeding expensive hay through a summer that wasn't supposed to need it. Others ordered hay and paid whatever the market was asking, which in that dry year was plenty. The coffee shop in Bedford was grim, farmers nursing their coffee and talking about precipitation deficits and whether they should have sold futures earlier in the spring. Out on Russ's 120 acres, things looked different. Not perfect. The grass wasn't lush. Some paddocks were coming back slower than he'd like. He'd stretched his rest periods, going from 35 to 40 days between grazings, watching the plants closely. Sometimes skipping a paddock entirely if the regrowth wasn't adequate. He was managing by what the grass told him, not by the calendar. But the cows were eating. The root systems that had been rebuilding for 3 years, root systems that now went 6, 8, 10 inches deeper than they had in year 1, were pulling moisture from levels that the shallower-rooted continuous pastures couldn't reach. The soil organic matter that had been climbing was holding water longer. The paddocks weren't green and lush, but they were functional. They were producing grass when most of Taylor County had given up on it. Russ didn't say anything about this to anyone. He just kept moving the cattle. One afternoon in late July, a Tuesday, Russ remembers it clearly. He heard a truck come up his driveway and looked up to see Leroy Barnes getting out. Leroy stood by his truck for a moment, looking at the paddocks. Then he walked to the fence and stood there without speaking for a while. Russ waited. Finally, Leroy said, "You're not buying hay this summer?" Russ answered, "Not yet." Leroy looked at the paddock. A group of cow-calf pairs was working through the grass, calm and steady. Not crowded, not anxious, the way cattle are when they know there's enough. Then Leroy looked at Russ. "I thought this was stupid. Still think it looks a little stupid. But your cows are eating." He got back in his truck and drove away. Russ stood there for a moment. He didn't feel vindicated exactly. He felt something quieter than that. More like confirmation. Like the slow accumulation of evidence had just tipped past a threshold. But he also knew he wasn't done. Not by a long way. That same summer, Russ hit a problem he hadn't fully anticipated. The southern paddocks, the ones with the drainage issue he'd mapped in year 1, were performing worse than the rest. The wet conditions in spring had delayed growth, and the dry July had then stressed those paddocks differently than the others. The brome there was weak and patchy. He was having to skip those paddocks more often, which was throwing off the rotation and putting more pressure on the better ground. He called Dale Hofstetter. Dale drove out on a Thursday morning, and they walked those southern paddocks together for 2 hours. Dale bent down, pulled back brome clumps, looked at the root structure, pushed a soil probe into the wet low spots. Then he straightened up and told Russ what he'd suspected. Those areas needed a different approach. Maybe overseed with orchard grass, which tolerates wet conditions better. Maybe rethink the paddock boundaries to keep the cattle off those sections during the wettest periods. It wasn't a crisis, but it was a reminder that this wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it system. It required attention. It required adjustment. The land was telling him things, and he had to be willing to listen and respond. Russ spent that fall overseeding the southern paddocks and adjusting his fence line in that section. It added cost. It added work. Carol looked at the ledger again with that expression, but Russ had seen enough by then to know the direction things were moving. He just needed more time. By the fall of 1998, Russ had been running the rotational system for 6 years. He'd kept the notebook the whole time. 6 notebooks, actually, 1 per year, filled with grass heights and paddock notes and weather observations and the kinds of small daily measurements that nobody else would have found interesting, but that, stacked together, told a complete story. When he sat down at the kitchen table with Carol that October and spread the numbers out, what they showed was this. Soil organic matter, from 2.1% to 3.4%. That might sound like a small number. It's not. Every 0.1% of organic matter in the top 6 inches of an acre of soil represents roughly 1,000 pounds of organic material. Carbon, nitrogen, the biological infrastructure that makes soil function. Going from 2.1 to 3.4% meant the soil was fundamentally different than it had been. It held more water. It supported more biological activity. It grew grass better. Carrying capacity, from 0.6 to 1.1 cow-calf pairs per acre. In practical terms, when Russ started, the land could reasonably support about 72 cow-calf pairs. 6 years later, the same 120 acres was carrying 132 pairs, without degrading the system. The land had nearly doubled its productivity, not through inputs, not through tillage or fertilizer or chemicals, through rest and timing and moving cattle the way the grass needed them to move. Hay purchases, down sharply, even in dry years. In 1993, his first full year, hay costs on the CRP ground had been significant. By 1997 and 1998, even in seasons with below-average rainfall, he was barely buying any hay at all for this ground. The extended root systems, the improved soil water retention, the diversity of plant species that had started coming back in, it all meant the pastures stayed productive longer into dry periods. The land that a real estate agent had called dirt and disappointment was now the most productive pasture ground Russ owned. And it had cost him less than $900 to set up the system. Word travels in small counties. It travels slowly, the way most things travel in rural Iowa, but it travels. By 1997, Russ had farmers stopping by who weren't there to shake their heads. They were there to ask questions, seriously, with notebooks of their own. How do you figure your rotation? What's your target grazing height? How did you handle the dry summer of '95? What do you do when a paddock isn't recovering fast enough? Russ answered every question, showed them his notebooks, walked them through the paddocks and pointed out the differences. The diversity of plant species that had returned, the places where you could see the soil profile had changed, just by the way water moved after a rain. Leroy Barnes came back too. One afternoon, just the two of them walking a paddock that had once been the worst on the property. The compacted middle section that had looked like nothing would ever grow there worth eating. Now there was a mix of grasses, some legumes that had volunteered in, the soil noticeably softer underfoot. Leroy didn't say much. He bent down and grabbed a handful of soil the way farmers do, rubbed it between his fingers, looked at the color, smelled it. Then he straightened up and said, "All right, show me how you set up the wire." Russ set up Leroy's system the following spring. Russ Wischover's story isn't complicated once you strip away all the doubt and the neighbor commentary and the dry summers and the ledger sheets with the wrong numbers in the early years. The land wasn't dead, it was neglected. Those are different things. Dead means finished, done, no way back. Neglected means the capacity is still there. It just hasn't been activated. The brome had suppressed everything below it. The compaction had limited what roots could do. The lack of grazing pressure meant no nutrient cycling, no disturbance, no reason for the soil biology to ramp back up. But underneath all of that, the ingredients were present. They just needed the right conditions. What rotational grazing provided wasn't magic. It was timing. When you graze a plant down to the right height and then pull the cattle off and give that plant 35 or 40 days to recover before grazing it again, several things happen that don't happen under continuous pressure. The plant rebuilds its root system instead of constantly diverting energy to leaf regrowth. Deeper roots mean access to more water and minerals. More root mass means more carbon deposited into the soil when roots die and decompose. More carbon means more food for soil microorganisms. More microorganisms means better soil structure. Better soil structure means better water infiltration. Better water infiltration means the next dry summer doesn't hit as hard. It's a chain. Each link reinforces the next. And it works on the time scale of years, not months. Which is why most people don't try it, and why the people who do try it often quit before the chain gets long enough to feel. Russ didn't quit. Not because he was stubborn in the blind, unreasonable way, but because he was measuring. He had his notebooks. He could see, even in year one, when the numbers were modest, that the direction was right. The paddocks were responding. The soil was changing, slowly, but measurably. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was tracking. And tracking is what separated him from his neighbors who looked at the same experiment and only saw the polywire and the string fence and decided it wasn't working. They were looking at a photo. Russ was reading a graph. There's a version of this story that ends with Russ being proved right and everyone else being proved wrong. And that's a satisfying version, but it's not quite the whole truth. The whole truth is that Russ got lucky in some ways too. He found the right extension agent in Dale Hofstetter. He bought ground that was degraded, but not irreparably so. The CRP years had at least stopped the active damage. He had a wife who kept the books honestly, and a son who was willing to do the physical work without complaining. He had access to resources and information that not every farmer in 1992 could easily find. And he had the particular kind of stubbornness that isn't about ego, it's about evidence. He stayed the course because the evidence, month by month and paddock by paddock, kept telling him to. The day the evidence had told him something different, Russ would have changed course. That's not blind stubbornness, that's discipline. What he didn't do was, he didn't till the ground and replant it from scratch, which would have cost tens of thousands of dollars and destroyed whatever soil biology had survived the CRP years. He didn't apply heavy fertilizer to try to force the brome into better performance, which would have produced a short-term result and a longer-term dependency. He didn't overstock the pasture to try to generate income faster, which would have destroyed the root systems he was trying to rebuild. He didn't give up when year one didn't look the way he'd hoped. He just kept moving the cattle. He kept measuring. He kept adjusting. And the land, slowly, stubbornly, on its own schedule, not his, came back. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't to add something new. It's to stop doing what's killing it, and then give it the time it needs.